The air was thick with tension as protests filled the streets, voices rising in a chorus of anger and demand for justice. In the middle of the chaos, a black man stood calmly, his hands raised in a peaceful stance. But in an instant, without warning, a white police officer lifted a canister and sprayed tear gas directly into his face. The man staggered back, coughing, his eyes burning. The officer had no idea who he had just attacked. This wasn't just any protester. This was a U.S. Air Force general, a man who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting the very country that now turned its weapons on him. As the crowd erupted in outrage, the officer remained unaware of the weight of his actions. What happened next would change everything. Stay with us as we uncover the shocking truth behind this moment and its powerful aftermath. The general dropped to one knee, his vision blurred, gas searing his lungs. Around him, protesters shouted in disbelief, some rushing to help. The officer, still gripping the canister, barked orders for the crowd to move back. He had no idea that the man struggling to breathe before him had spent decades in service, leading troops, making split-second decisions in war zones far more dangerous than this city street. Minutes passed before another officer recognized him, eyes widening in shock. The realization spread like wildfire among the force. This wasn't just any civilian, but instead of immediate apologies, there was hesitation, uncertainty. Would they admit their mistake? Would they even care? The general, still recovering, knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. The question now wasn't just about what had happened, but what would happen next. And that answer would shake the system. The general wiped his face, his eyes still burning, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had faced high-pressure situations before, but this moment felt different. This wasn't a battlefield overseas, this was home. And here, in his own country, he was being treated like a threat, not a leader. Around him, the crowd grew louder, demanding answers, demanding justice. Yet, the officer who had sprayed him stood rigid, his expression unreadable, still gripping his weapon as if danger lurked in every shadow. Nearby, another officer whispered something into his radio. Was it an order to de-escalate, or a call for backup? The general knew how these situations could spiral. He had seen it too many times before, but this time he wasn't just a witness. He was at the center of it. Would his identity change anything? Or would he be just another man in the crowd, stripped of his rank, his service, his humanity? The crowd pressed in closer, their voices rising with anger and disbelief. Phones were out, cameras rolling. This wasn't just another moment lost in the chaos. This was being documented, every second captured for the world to see. The officer who had used the tear gas shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening on his gear. He still hadn't spoken, hadn't acknowledged what he had done. Maybe he didn't know how to react, or maybe he didn't care. Then, a commanding voice cut through the noise. Another officer, higher in rank, pushed through the line and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the general. His face paled, the energy in the air shifted. The officers exchanged glances, silent messages passing between them. The general, still catching his breath, finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "Do you know who I am?" The officer hesitated, swallowing hard. The moment hung between them like a fragile thread, ready to snap. The officer's jaw tightened, his hesitation betraying his uncertainty. He knew now, everyone did. The whispers among the police force, the glances exchanged, the tension in the air, it all confirmed the realization sinking in. This wasn't just another protester. This was a high-ranking U.S. Air Force general. But instead of stepping back, instead of acknowledging a mistake, the officer squared his shoulders. His pride, his authority, his training, everything told him to stand firm. Then, just as the silence stretched unbearably long, another voice broke through. A young protester, phone in hand, called out, "It shouldn't have to matter who he is." The words struck deep. The general turned, looking at the faces in the crowd, faces filled with frustration, exhaustion, and pain. He had been given the benefit of the doubt because of his rank, But what about everyone else? The realization sent a new wave of tension through the crowd. This wasn't just about one man. This was about something much bigger. The officer's grip loosened slightly, his confidence shaken, but still, he said nothing. The general took a step forward, his presence commanding, his eyes locked onto the man who had just attacked him. "You judged me before you knew me," he said, his voice steady. "Now that you know, does it change anything?" The officer opened his mouth, but no words came. The truth hung in the air. If this could happen to a general, what hope did others have? Then, just as the tension reached its peak, a senior police official arrived, pushing through the crowd. His eyes darted from the officer to the general, then to the dozens of phones recording every second. He knew this had already spiraled beyond control. After a long pause, he turned to the officer. "Stand down," he ordered. The officer hesitated, then finally lowered his weapon. Relief washed over the crowd, but the general wasn't done. He took a deep breath and turned to the protesters. "This isn't just my story," he said. "This is all of ours." The real twist came moments later, when the general, despite everything, extended his hand toward the officer. A choice hung in the air: redemption or resistance. The world watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The officer stared at the general's outstretched hand, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The crowd held its breath, waiting. Then, after a long pause, he finally reached out and shook it. It wasn't just a handshake, it was a statement, a turning point. But for the general, this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about recognition, about accountability, about forcing a conversation that couldn't be ignored any longer. As the cameras continued rolling, the senior officer stepped in, speaking in hushed tones to his team. The officer who had sprayed the tear gas was quietly led away, but the damage had already been done. The general looked around at the people still gathered, their eyes filled with both pain and hope. Walking away, he knew this moment wouldn't fix everything, but maybe, just maybe, it would open the door for change. And that, he thought, was worth fighting for.